Yeah.
I'm so happy to be here this morning with Roger Marshall, who had a conversation with Paul Vanderklay earlier in the week. And Roger reached out to me and said he had some ideas he wanted to discuss with me. So I'm eager to hear them. Roger sent me an essay that he had written on the God of the Philosophers. And I learned so much from reading it that I'm going to post it in the show notes so that everybody else can read as well. And Roger, I wonder if you could introduce yourself and then tell me why you reached out to me and what it is you'd like to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Roger Marshall, as you correctly introduced me. I've been a teacher of English language and some literature with the British Council in Barcelona for the last 35 years. I've just retired. And now I'm living not in Barcelona, but in a very nice small city, just about 20 kilometers south of Barcelona on the Mediterranean coast.
Oh,
and
that's
the name
tough.
of it is Castelldefels, which probably won't mean very much to most of your most of the listeners to the channel, because it's not all that well known outside Spain, but it does attract quite a few visitors in the summer. It's got a very long beach, and yeah, it's a great great place to spend one's retirement. And yeah, as regards I really enjoyed the conversation with Paul. It was the first experience of this kind of interaction, and so I was and still am a little bit nervous about this.
We're all just folks here.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly just what I am as well. I mean, but yeah, I've been listening to your channel, and I've heard some very engaging conversations on it, which we might have an opportunity to comment on later. But I thought, yeah, this is I thought I would like to just reach out to you, have a conversation about some of the issues that I tried to address in the essay, but also, yeah, just meaning, knowledge, not just what it is, but what it can and what it should lead to as well. And I realized from your conversations that that's one of the topics that you have addressed very frequently with some of your interlocutors. So I thought, yeah, let's go for it. And you very kindly agreed to have a chat with me. So here we are.
Yeah, and I would like to say to everybody who's listening that you can all reach out to me if you want to. In fact, if there's anybody listening to this that would like to reach out and have a conversation, just make a comment in the comment section and we'll connect one way or another. I think my email address might actually be in the about section of my YouTube channel. So, and if not, there is a on my art website, KarenWongArt.com, there's also a link to reach out and talk to me. So yeah, so one of the things that I really appreciated about that essay that you wrote was the way that you connected just the trajectory of thought from the very earliest philosophers up until, well, actually you come pretty much up until the present day, but where it really helped me was kind of wiring things together all the way up to, say, maybe Aquinas, because I've read little bits here and there, and I'm ADD enough that when I listen to some of the, I love Arthur Holmes's philosophy lectures.
Oh yes,
it's just wonderful. But I
yes,
tend to
I got a lot out of that.
Order. Yeah. I listen to whichever one comes up on the algorithm, and sometimes, so it might be Hegel, or then it might be Aristotle, and then it might be Heraclitus, and then the next one might be Spinoza. And so, in my mind, they get kind of all jumbled up because I didn't start at the beginning and listen all the way through. So
yeah, in writing it, I mean, I realized that there were going to have to be a great a large number of gaps as well. I mean, especially as regards modern philosophy, because I'm not a philosopher. I don't really have philosophical training. I've done a lot of reading recently, but there are huge gaps in my knowledge. And I'm sure some readers of the essay might feel that I've misrepresented some of their favorite philosophers, and that may well be the case, you know. So yeah.
When you're trying to write a paragraph on somebody about whom dozens, if not hundreds of books have been written, it's a little bit hard to represent them completely fairly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But
I'm aware that John Vervaeke, for example, might have issues, if he were ever to read it, with my representation of Plotinus and Schleiermacher, but I mean, I'm open to have any kind of misrepresentations kind of corrected, but I wanted to think through it for myself and come up with a kind of an overview that would be helpful for myself in rereading it. And I'm very fond of Pascal's philosophy. I did Pascal when I was doing French at university. I did French and Spanish at university, including Pascal, in the case of French, Unamuno, whom I really found challenging to read, but very, very interesting, and forced me to, to think outside the box, the theological box that I was familiar with and that I felt comfortable in, and the same is true of Pascal. So I thought that his Memorial his record of his conversion, which was not actually intended by him to be included in the Pensée. It was found sewn into the inside of his coat, I think after death, in fact. But it really, I thought it was a good starting point, in the sense that he distinguished between the God of the philosophers, God number one, perhaps, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who reveals himself, the God with agency, with not just an entity that exists in some kind of transcendent sphere that we don't have access to, and about whom or about which we cannot gain very much knowledge. We can reach a kind of conclusion that some entity of that kind might exist, but that causes him, if that's the kind of God that we believe in, then it's not the kind of God that we can have any kind of meaningful relationship with. In a sense, a God of that kind isn't worth believing in, because, yeah, well, that was what the kind of conclusion that I tried to, that I hope I kind of ended up clarifying. And yeah, that it's the God of, it's a personal God. It's God's personhood, God's agency, God's self-revelation, especially in the incarnation, is a fundamental and absolutely essential tenet of any believer's faith in God, right? But it's probably not what a lot of people understand when they talk about God. You know, they are possibly not thinking of a person with the kind of agency that the God of the Bible has. So
I think one of the, when I read a lot of these atheist scientists or even agnostic scientists who are reluctant, more than reluctant, to believe that there might be, that if there is a God, that he might in some way be a person, the way that they're interpreting person, when they hear that word, they're totally interpreting person as being like that big guy up in the sky.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
right, like an embodied,
Yeah.
very much the way I interpret it is they're thinking of him, someone like Thor or Zeus,
Yes.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
Rather than, so in one sense, it seems to me that there is some value in looking at the transcendent God, who is the one who is above all,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why the language surrounding Christ is so powerful, because when the New Testament talks about Christ, he is always all in all. He is the one who holds all things together. He is
Yeah.
the one who fills us, and at the same time we are in him. And so you get this much more kind of expansive picture that God can be the transcendent one, and at the same time the very personal entity that interacts with us, right?
Yeah. I don't think it's necessary to believe in God as an embodied entity, except in the incarnation, you know,
Right. Yeah.
because that's precisely what the incarnation is. It's the embodiment of God becoming, not God becoming a person, but God becoming human, God taking on human flesh. He was a person before that, well, before the incarnation, or there is a, yeah, I mean, all of this is very mysterious, and we're not going to be able by any means to sort out just what the Trinity is.
Well, it just occurred to me that maybe the reason we get messed up with this idea of person is that we tend to see ourselves as the center of the universe. So because I'm a person, then I imagine that God must be a person like me. And so I can define the personhood of God by looking at my own personhood, but it's completely the opposite.
Yeah.
I'm a person.
I suppose it's understandable that people have difficulty getting.
I mean, I'm a person because God is a person.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Our personhood. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So my personhood needs to be defined in terms of his personhood rather than the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I think C.S. Lewis wrote an essay. Oh, it was part of Mere Christianity, actually, called "Beyond Personality." You know, which I think, I think that's the section of Mere Christianity in which he addresses the issue of the Trinity. I can't remember exactly what he said about it, but yeah, taking us beyond the conception of person that we as embodied human beings have, and it's the category within which we conceive of personhood. We find it difficult to think of personhood except in that sense, but I think scripture actually challenges us to think of God's personhood in a much larger sense. Okay, but yeah, it's difficult. So yeah, I mean, I've been challenged by listening to John Vervaeke and his referring to himself as a non-theist rather than as an atheist. Have you had a conversation with John Vervaeke?
Oh no, no, I have not.
Okay.
I listened to his conversations with Paul.
Yeah.
I haven't listened to the series, the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series.
Yeah.
I listened to bits and pieces here and there when they were referred to me, but I haven't listened to the whole thing. I had a number of conversations on my channel with Mark dissecting the conversation that John Vervaeke had with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
That gave me some insight into the way John thinks, because we did 6 episodes, I think. So I had to really listen and prepare and all of that. And then I've listened to the conversations he's had with Sevilla and with Jonathan Peugeot and with Paul Vanderklay. And so I think I have a little bit of an idea of how he thinks. I just think the going down the road of trying to develop a religion that is not a religion when we already have Christ is
Yeah.
it's just not it's not a fruitful path, I don't think.
Yeah, he refers to the sacred, and he has a great deal of respect for people who conceive of God in this sense in which we do, but rather than refer to God, he refers to the sacred, and as a metaphysical reality. I mean, he would refer to himself as a Neoplatonist. I think he defines himself as a Neoplatonist. I don't expect that I will.
Well, since you have a lot more background in all of this philosophy, especially like the Neoplatonists and before them, than I do. So maybe you could help me out with something. When they talk about the sacred and the metaphysical and if there is no God, where did all that come from? I mean, are they thinking, and even John Vervaeke, if there is no God, then all this stuff that he thinks is so beautiful and sacred, where did that come from? Is that just because evolution got us to the point where we can have these sacred thoughts and then we have a collective sacred thought or something? Or, I mean, I don't understand how you can have this kind of beautiful view of how the world works and think it just sort of came out of nothing. I don't, something's missing to me there.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I mentioned in the essay, we necessarily need to find a placeholder for that, for God, for the being, well, as we would say, person who, out of whose nature, out of whose essence, everything, in a sense, flows. Everything derives, and he spoke the universe into existence, which I think, and John Vervaeke himself refers to, in the beginning was the word. That I think he places a lot of store by that. In the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God, and without him nothing that was made, nothing that was created was made. So he kind of spoke the universe, the logos. Which is interesting that Jordan Peterson refers to the logos a great deal, as well as that overarching meaning. The first things, that which precedes everything else, but which is fundamentally characterized by meaning. The very term cosmos implies order. It implies the appearance of order, as opposed to the chaos that probably would be the case had meaning not shaped the emergence of reality. I'm a little bit out of my depth here, I think, because but that's that's the sense in which I understand it, you know. But I have, having said that, although I would obviously kind of take issue with John Vervaeke's Neoplatonism, you know, I have learned a great deal from
Oh yeah, no question.
what he has said, and there are some very, very interesting insights that he has that I find very helpful. You know, when he talks about when he defines belief not as assent to intellectual assent to a set of propositions, but as a commitment of one's whole being, of one's whole self, trust, you know, which is, I think, how the Bible requires us to think of faith. That's
well, actually, the word believe, as it's used in the New Testament over and over again, it has been translated believe. I'm not sure why it's been translated believe, because when you go back and look at the Greek, it definitely says trust. And it implies a kind of trust. I mean, when I was a new believer, the way it was explained to me was this: I can watch that guy walk across the Grand Canyon on that little wire that he throws out there, and I can believe that he's very competent and capable, and I can even believe that he's going to get to the other side.
Yeah.
Right.
You wouldn't do it.
But until I'm willing to get into a little cart behind him and hold on to his shirt tails while he walks across there, I don't really trust. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the difference between trust and belief. You can believe a lot of things, but you have to put your whole weight into it.
Yeah, I think that's that links up with what John Vervaeke, the 4 different kinds of knowledge that he refers to, participatory knowledge, which rather than propositional knowledge, or more than or beyond propositional knowledge, involves a commitment of the whole self, right? And that's the kind of knowledge that we perhaps have understated when we have talked about knowledge, and even when we have shared the gospel, we seek a kind of intellectual, and we maybe satisfy ourselves with an intellectual response, an intellectual assent on the part of our interlocutors. And that's one of the problems, I think, as I've mentioned in the conversation with Paul van der Klee, one of the problems with the debate format, you know, where Christians are kind of sparring, you know, with atheists, but exchanging competing propositions, as if, you know, to gain the intellectual assent of the interlocutor, or if not, of members of the public, and that might of members of the audience or people who listen in, and that might work for some people. It might help to overcome certain barriers, you know. Sorry?
I doubt it. It might overcome certain barriers. I mean, some people might think, oh, well, this guy is smarter than I gave him credit for, you know. But I don't think it's going to move. I mean, certainly for a personality type like me, it wouldn't move me, because once somebody is in a contentious debate of some kind, I just shut off, man. I don't want to hear what they have to say. So.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I've had personal experience of both, and I've perhaps erred on this side of emphasizing propositional kind of commitments and propositional knowledge, and trying to, because I mean, in conversations, many conversations that I've had with on you know, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, or people kind of situated at different points along the spectrum, you know, from total atheism, to kind of something approaching belief, or at least openness, to the gospel. And I mean, I see myself as being not involved in debates, but involved in relationships with these people and building friendships. The conversation is so much more than just an exchange of propositions, exchange of ideas,
Well, I think what happens, at least what has happened to me, when I used to get into that frame where I would answer questions with a propositional viewpoint, if I would reflect back on those conversations, it was often because of the way the question was asked. The person's attitude when they ask a question is going to influence the way it gets answered. And I think that's just inevitable. If somebody asks me a question and they're contentious in their asking, then I'm either going to get contentious or I'm going to get defensive, right? Yeah. Or I'm going to get shut down, so I can't think straight. And so then whatever is the easiest thing to answer is going to come to the fore, because I want to protect myself from.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
And that's inevitable. That's going to happen. But
what I was going to say is, for me, one of the blessings that I had as a new Christian was that I became a believer in a very small little country church with a very down-to-earth little country pastor and very down-to-earth country people. And there was no propositional stuff going on at all.
Yeah.
It was all love and faith and trust and community. And so but later on, when I was living in a different environment around people who were more intellectual and wanted to understand things at a higher level, when they'd ask me a question, how do I convey to them this whole body of experience that I was in? Mm-hmm. You can't put that in a sentence. They have to live that with you. You have to get into the same kind of a situation and live it with them, which is why building relationship is so much better, because then you can try to help them enter into that world with you.
Yeah, and it obliges you to be authentic, and you're making yourself vulnerable, to and as the relationship grows, I mean, they're going to become aware of your shortcomings as well, and as long as we're honest about that, then I mean, I think that can enhance the relationship and because I mean, that's the Bible itself is a compendium of heroes and villains, spiritual heroes who didn't really make it, through whom God was working in extraordinary ways, but who really messed up in spectacular ways as well. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's what's so compelling about scripture, that it's so real, and it's liberating as well, for us to realize that it's okay if we're broken, and if we're fractured, and if there are certain things that we are not getting right, and our relationships that have failed, that can be part of our of the authenticity that that kind of resonates with people, and perhaps gives the message the kind of
Well,
ring
and
of truth.
that's one of those old-timey simple illustrations that we used to hear, is that we are cracked pots, cracked jars,
Yeah,
but that's how the light gets out, right?
that's right.
If we weren't
Yeah.
cracked, then the light wouldn't be able to get out and show others
No,
the
and
light. So
I take great comfort in that, personally, because I've got kind of baggage, I've had experience of brokenness in different areas, but yeah, but it's so liberating and so wonderful to read. Just well, it's grace, it's what God can do with the most unpromising of material.
I like that, unpromising material. I'm going to put that in my bio.
Yeah. I haven't actually used that phrase in any of the CVs that I've written.
Oh.
While looking.
Yeah, in today's world, that would get you in trouble, wouldn't it? My husband has, we've been married a long time, so he's obviously gone for a lot of job interviews. And in the early days, he would always have me role play with him before he'd go into a job interview.
Oh, right.
And of course, the books that tell you how to interview, they always tell you the kinds of questions you're going to be asked. And somebody's going to ask you this question: what are your 3 biggest weaknesses?
Yeah.
So you have to find a way to spin your weaknesses so that they sound like strengths,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, we're not supposed to do that.
Yeah.
I guess as a Christian, the way that I spin my weakness into a strength is that, because when I am weak, he is strong. That's the spin, right?
Yeah, that's really that's the bottom line, that's but obviously that doesn't let us off the hook, it doesn't mean that we can relax in that in that kind of frame of mind, because it's that's precisely what the scripture prevents us from doing, from relaxing in any frame of mind, because because this the truth is it's well, and Jordan Peterson has been saying is very relevant in that regard. Truth is, if it is of any value, it must be aimed at transformation, and we're always going to be in need of transformation, truth, knowledge must be transformative, it cannot it cannot simply, it's not static, that's I think that's something that is kind of challenging, and it represents a temptation, I think, for young people kind of growing up in an evangelical setting with kind of opportunities to to show their gifts, to use their gifts, the use of our gifts must always be aimed at self-transformation and transformation, or it must be for the benefit of those that we are in a relationship with, in the context of the church, of the body, of the community. And the temptation is that our knowledge becomes performative rather than transformative, that that we become enticed by the kind of attractiveness, by the fact that other people find our gifts attractive and engaging. That can distract us from what is actually the main purpose of us having been given those gifts in the first place.
Mhm.
And
I think
I suppose
that's an especial problem, and I speak from personal experience. That's an especial problem in the evangelical church with the worship,
yeah,
the worship teams.
yeah,
I mean, I remember when I first started working on worship teams, one of the main things that they taught us is you are going to be a target of the enemy, because if he can
yeah,
destroy you, then you're not going to be in a place where you can rejoice and worship. And one of the primary ways that he will try to destroy you is make you feel like you're important, you're special.
yeah,
People are going to appreciate the music, they're going to appreciate your gifts, and they're going to try to build you up, and that's going to take you down.
yeah.
So people who are involved in worship, they need to be bathed in prayer by the rest of the, then that reminds me, I need to be praying for our worship teams a lot more. But you also, as a worship leader, you have to be very conscious of this whole dynamic. I mean, I think it's true for everybody, but some people it's just, you're kind of more exposed. So if you're up front
Yes.
all the time, I remember Jack Hayford, who is a pastor in the Foursquare denomination. He always said that, and he was very vulnerable about his own issues, that there were a lot of times that he'd be right in the middle of a message and the thought would go through his mind, man, that was a great turn of phrase, you really nailed that one. And then he couldn't concentrate for the rest of the message, because he had just killed the whole spirit working in him, with his own pride. And then you have to spend some time on your face, like, what is that all about? Because whatever gift I have is not from me, it's all from Christ.
Yeah, I suppose if God really wants to make something useful and effective of us, he will find ways of bringing us down a peg or two and deflating us, and that can be painful. But we need to kind of hang on, in the midst of that, and not allow ourselves to be completely thrown off course. But so, but this kind of this kind of opposition, or between, I suppose we're always going to be exhibiting a kind of a combination, of performative knowledge and transformative knowledge, and I think the Holy Spirit within us and within the community is going to be helping us to focus on and to major on transformation. And I mean, I found Jordan Peterson really helpful in that regard, that this the idea of kind of constantly moving upwards, and carrying whatever the burden is that we have been given to carry, because everybody has a burden to carry. And beginning with change, imposing order on the space that you most immediately inhabit, that is your room, transforming your own kind of environment, your immediate environment. And then as you'll become increasingly aware, I guess, and this is something that the Holy Spirit, I suppose, working within us, enables us gradually see, that which is still remaining to be ordered, that which is still remaining to be dealt with, and we're never allowed to relax or to become complacent. And I've when watching Jordan Peterson tear up, when he talks about the individuals that he has been able to help in that regard, I think it's been very, very impressive to me. And this is somebody with absolutely no egotism. I think he's a huge example for Christians involved in any kind of interpersonal ministry or therapy or counseling or just community.
Well, I think there's a sense in which some of that tearing up is really like the beginnings of the Holy Spirit breaking through in his life, because
very much so.
I think there's a part of him that fully recognizes that he is not the one responsible for the transformation of those people.
He does, yeah.
Right? And that even he is not the one who's responsible for being in the spotlight, that it was some move outside of himself that pushed him into the spotlight, right? And that it is that being in the spotlight and using the opportunity that was given to him, and then that action is causing transformation in people, that's all something outside of himself. I think he's very cognizant of that.
Yeah,
but it's not like I got to the pinnacle of my career and I got out there with my message and people were being transformed. There's no triumphalism in that at all.
Absolutely not.
How did I get here? And why are these people being transformed? And there's something bigger than me, and I don't know what it is. It's that kind of being overpowered by the magnificence of whatever it is that has a grip on him.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And he has no hesitation in referring to this external entity as God, even though he's not sure exactly what that entity is yet, or who that entity is, and it's wonderful to see how his daughter has come to faith as well, and that's.
Did you see her conversation with Jonathan Peugeot?
I did see her conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, yes.
Yeah, I was watching it this morning. I'm not done yet, but very interesting, very refreshing, I would say.
It is refreshing, yeah. And I think Jonathan Peugeot was being very fair in the advice that he was giving, rather than trying to orientate her too much in any particular kind of denominational direction, although I think he slightly perhaps misrepresented Protestantism when he...
I felt that too, yeah, a little bit.
Because I think he's only looking at
whatever wing, whatever wing he was in, that's what he's representing.
That's what he was experiencing.
I mean, the thing I've been noticing lately, because I'm in a sort of a Presbyterian church that a while back pulled out of the bigger Presbyterian denomination and is a little bit going on their own. But the thing I've noticed recently is that they've begun to move into more liturgical territory. They're trying to respond to what the Spirit is teaching them. Let's put it that way.
I think that makes sense. I mean, right? I would be totally on board with that.
Yeah, and then there's been more reading of scripture during the service, and there's been more response time and more emphasis on spiritual formation in the community and more emphasis on small groups being the life of the church. And so I've seen that move over the last 2 or 3 years, especially. And so it makes me feel like maybe that move of the Spirit is taking place in all these denominations, right?
And bringing them
the truth
together in a sense, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've for a number of years been involved with student ministry, IVF, you know, the IFES, and also Agape, you know, Campus Crusade, and my experience of those movements is that, you know, you have Christians from many different Protestant denominations, but they're totally committed to the same goals, and there may be a little bit of kind of disputation, you know, over certain issues, but I think it's important not to overstate that as well, you know, that Christians coming together from different denominations can actually learn from each other. Maybe we don't enough. You know, it's true that the Protestant history has been littered with division and with denominations falling out with each other, and people within denominations falling out with each other and forming different denominations. Obviously, that's going to continue, you know. But there's something kind of dynamic about that as well. It's not all bad news that has happened. And as you say, there's a kind of a coming together, and perhaps a greater emphasis, even on historically non-liturgical churches, on kind of incorporating liturgy of some kind, and even borrowing from or learning from the great kind of liturgical traditions of the church, and maybe more openness to the patristic traditions, the church fathers, and which I think we have been ignoring to our detriment, you know. And I think we need to do this. We need, but I think it is happening. And also, I mentioned to Paul this idea of, well, he's very keen on the concept of estuary as a space where, you know, people from different conceptions of God, or different levels of belief in God or no belief at all, kind of come together and learn from each other and share, rather than you know, they're being kind of driven by the monitor of those conversations in any particular direction, which I think that's great, you know, because we do learn from each other. But maybe there's an opportunity for, and I suppose it is happening as well in some places, you know, estuaries, Christian estuaries, involving people from different liturgical traditions, you know, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, and other expressions of Christianity, kind of coming together and learning from each other, rather than trying to convert each other to their way of understanding the Christian gospel. Yeah, I don't know. I think there is scope.
I wonder, though, if it isn't inevitable, if people come together like that, and there are people who are really walking in the Spirit, filled with the Spirit as part of a group like that, is it really possible that there would not be a coalescing around Christ eventually?
It will. I think that's.
I can't imagine that everybody would just have these conversations and that it wouldn't go anywhere. I mean, there's a certain flow that tends to move towards Christ when people are actually hearing truth and Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the hypothetical case in the conversation with Paul, the hypothetical case of a context in which you have like 8 or 9 different Christian denominations
Mm-hmm.
finding themselves under persecution in the same location, and not having other members of the same tradition to have fellowship with. They will have no choice but to have fellowship with each other if
Mm-hmm.
they are genuinely committed to Christ, and the Holy Spirit will find ways of causing that group of people to somehow coalesce around Christ and to do church together, despite what might be very substantial kind of barriers, to be overcome before that can happen. But yeah, I don't know if we'll ever find ourselves in that situation.
Well, I mean, I have an example popped into my head immediately when you said that, because I was missionary in Japan back in the mid 80s. And we were in the summers, we would be in this town up on the northern coast of Japan, just across from Russia. You can probably see Russia from there.
Really?
But it was in Japanese terms, it was a very small town, about 200,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
And in this town, there was a small Catholic church with maybe, I want to say 10 people in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And the church that we were in was a small Protestant church with maybe 6 or 8 regular attenders.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty much it for the whole town. Now,
Really?
Our job in the summer was to teach English classes at this church during the week, every day. And then people would come in for the English class. And at the end of the class, we would give a little chapel time and tell a little story. And, hopefully that some of those people would become interested and would start going to the church. Now, you would think that these two churches, that the believers would have fellowship with one another, because they're in this town of 200,000 people. They're the only 20 believers there. But that's not the way it worked out. But partly the reason that wasn't the way it worked out was that the pastor of the church that we were stationed at, and this might just be Japanese tradition, I don't know, his father had been pastor of that church. And when his father had become pastor of that church there was a big revival right after the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people coming to Christ in Japan, and they were asking, send us missionaries because we need help here. There's so much going on. So there was this great flowering of faith after the Second World War that didn't last very long. But his father became a pastor during that flowering of faith and had started this little church and was teaching. He had preschool in the church, and he had classes during the week for all kinds of people. And it had begun to be kind of a thriving church. And then he died, and his son, who was a businessman, felt a familial obligation to come back and pastor the church, even though he was not a believer.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this situation where you have this thriving church and this guy who comes back just going through the motions, because that was his family obligation. And that's the situation that we landed in when we got into that church. Here's this pastor who's not a believer. He knows all the rules, right? But none of the grace.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many stories I could tell. But there were 2 young men that became Christians during this time that were teaching English. And they started coming to the church, and they were very excited about their faith, and they wanted to participate in everything. But because this guy was not a pastor, he hadn't gone to Bible school, he was not ordained, and so he was not permitted to offer communion or to do baptisms.
Mm-hmm.
So once a year, the denomination would send around an ordained pastor to offer communion to the participants and to offer baptism for anybody who wanted it. So our two boys are so excited. They're going to get to have communion for the first time. The visiting pastor comes, and the pastor of the church, the not ordained one, he's the one tasked with handing around the elements while the ordained pastor is doing his thing. And he passes right over our two boys and won't allow them to participate in the communion.
Wow. Why?
And after the service was over, we asked him what happened, because they're just heartbroken, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, well, they haven't been baptized yet, so they can't have communion. That's the rule.
Mm-hmm.
I'm laughing,
That
but
sounds
it was
familiar,
not
actually.
funny
Yeah.
at the time. It was so tragic. It was
Yeah,
so
yeah.
painful to watch. So then we said, well, why haven't they been baptized yet? He said, well, I'm not ordained. I can't baptize them. And I said, well, this guy is here. Let him baptize them. Oh, they're not prepared yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so finally, we said we were going to take things into our own hands. We took those two boys out to the ocean. We baptized them. I mean, they loved Jesus. They wanted to follow Jesus. We got into a boatload of trouble with our mission because we had stepped above this pastor. Wow. Memories.
Wow. Yeah. And how did that work out? Did you?
We ended up leaving.
Just...
We ended up leaving the mission over that and moving over to help. We stayed in Japan and moved over to help a non-denominational church that was reaching out in the inner city to college students.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in the midst of doing that. And you probably haven't heard my story on this. I don't want to bore everybody with it, but we were in the midst of doing that when my husband came to me one day and told me he was gay and he was in love with a man and he was leaving me.
My goodness.
And that meant that obviously I didn't feel like I could accept subsistence money from the mission anymore.
Yeah.
Well, we had left the original mission, but we had tasked our home pastor with being the one who would be willing to gather donations from people that wanted to support us. So I didn't feel like I could take that money anymore. I mean, today that would be like being on Patreon, right? But I felt that it would be for me to be there by myself. Just didn't seem like that would work. And so I ended up coming back to the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, the story ends beautifully. So, I mean, the end of the story is that I ended up coming back to the United States, meeting a wonderful Christian man, marrying him, having another baby at the age of 46. And she would never have been born if it hadn't been for that situation, right? So she's my miracle. I look at her all the time and I say, that crushing, painful, transformative experience that I went through resulted in this beautiful young woman. So
yeah, that's quite inspiring, really. I mean, yeah, what the enemy intends as a means of crushing us ends up being another means of grace, you know. And I've had experiences similar to that in some ways, yeah. But good. And another, I mentioned the estuary idea. I'm not sure if this is a subject that you've discussed with other interlocutors, you know, but yeah, it's something that I feel quite engaged by, an idea that I feel quite engaged by, and there are opportunities for that in the space which I inhabit now here in Castelldefels with the church, which has a restaurant that situation is possibly quite common in the US, but it's not so common here.
Mhm.
And I haven't come across many examples of it back in the UK either. A church which actually owns a working restaurant that is, so the space in the restaurant actually belongs to the church. It works as a restaurant during the week, serving the local community, you know, as any other restaurant would,
Mhm.
with lunch and dinners and barbecues, and it's very popular. But there are a couple of interesting characteristics of this project, which one of them is that it's called I think you might have heard me mention it in a conversation with Paul. It's a solidarity restaurant, so the helpers in the restaurant are being trained. They're undocumented immigrants in many cases, you know, who have come from different parts of the world, in some cases ended up in Spain on rafts and and boats kind of crossing the Mediterranean, or other means whereby they've ended up here. But when they go to the local council, the relationship with the local council is such that they send these people to the restaurant for training, for mentoring, in order to help them to prepare for the time when they're going to be able to be employed, because they can't be contracted for until they have their papers in order, which takes like about 3 years before they're legally entitled to have a work contract. And yeah, it's been very enriching for me to be kind of part of that in some way, and to get to know some of these people. But this restaurant space provides us also with an opportunity for in the case of what I'm doing, kind of English conversation workshops. You know, I'm doing one of those on Thursday mornings. I'm hoping to be able to develop that a bit more, because and the people coming along to those meetings, to those conversations, are not in most cases believers. I'm not sure where they might be along the kind of spectrum towards belief, but they're very receptive. So it's a space in which real, very constructive, very meaningful friendships can develop, you know, and can emerge. And so yeah, I don't know if you've got experiences of that kind of scenario, you know, because I'm very open to ideas. Where one of the things that we do once a month is we've got a reading circle, a reading group, and you know, we myself and a fellow Northern Irish friend, who's also a member of the church, and who also worked as an English teacher in Barcelona and also in the university, but he's specializes while he was at university, he did a doctorate in translations of James Joyce into English, so he knows quite a lot about James Joyce. So we got that ball rolling with a couple of sessions on some of James Joyce's short stories, and that has proved very interesting. We've done some Irish poetry. We're going to be doing some Shakespeare in about a week's time, and it's yeah, I find that it's a way in which conversations on spiritual issues, you know, can very naturally arise, you know, because obviously these works of literature have themes which can also be found in biblical stories, in the stories of patriarchs. They're stories about human beings. I think people find stories very compelling. That's why they enjoy cinema, watching films, Netflix. I think that.
Oh, so their English level must be substantially higher than the English level of most of the people that I worked with.
Yeah, in some cases it's quite good. Some of them are just very quick learners, from some of them from Eastern Europe, some. But yeah, obviously this space provides kind of opportunities, and there's other language teaching going on as well at lower levels. It's not only. This is the particular one that I'm involved.
Well, I think what you're doing sounds. I mean, it sounds just wonderful. I know here in where we live in Northern California, I've heard of several restaurants that are doing that kind of thing, but they're not associated with the church or with Christianity at all. But they are using their restaurant as an opportunity to train people and help them to get more skills so that they can, whether they're working with people who were underprivileged or people who have been addicted to drugs and alcohol, or in some cases people who are immigrants. I've run into several different restaurants like that, and I always thought it was a terrific model for how things could be done. And then when I was a new believer at that little country church, this was back in 1980, 81, there was a big influx of Vietnamese refugees at that time. And somehow, some way, I suppose it must have been the Reagan administration, because that would have been that era, they connected up the immigrant organization in the United States, somehow connected these people up with different churches. And our little country church ended up being responsible for 2 Vietnamese families. Any church that would accept these folks, they would come. And so it was our job to make sure that they found housing, that they found a job. And part of the volunteering work that I was doing was helping them with their English. And this was before I was trained as a teacher of English as second language, which I did later in graduate school. But before I did that, I was working with them, and we would just even take like a picture book Bible and just try to help them page by page understand a little bit of what was being said there, or take children's books of one kind or another, because they had no English at all, right? Just trying to help them get sorted out. And then later, years later, when I was in graduate school, my teaching assistantship was to work with doctoral students to help them in preparing their thesis, but they were preparing it in English rather than in their native language. And most of them had brought their wives with them because they knew they were going to be there for several years. And so I would volunteer to the husbands. I'd say, hey, I'd happily come and teach English to your wife. And in exchange for her teaching me how to cook, let's say, I'd make a deal like that, because otherwise, why do you want to do that? And, and so that opened a lot of opportunities for conversations and friendship.
That sounds very similar to what a friend of mine in Northern Ireland in a church in Belfast is doing, and the church itself is helping Chinese immigrants in particular. Well, not immigrants, some of them, as is the case that you've just described, they're kind of graduate or postdoc students in the university, which is very near the church, and kind of the students themselves or relatives, wives, husbands of the students can come to get English classes in the church that are kind of organized for them. And yeah, I know a number of people who have been involved in that. I think it's the kind of thing I would like to see happen more. I think it's a great opportunity for Christians in churches to really be involved in other people's lives as well, you know, rather, and we've tended to seclude ourselves from the wider community, and kind of, you know, form these kind of holy huddles, or the church has become a kind of a waiting room in the minds of many evangelicals, probably, especially, you know, we're just kind of waiting for Christ's return. When,
well, I mean, I've certainly seen a move in our area in the last, I want to say 10 or 15 years, a more intentional move towards getting the church involved in the community.
Yeah.
So they have this thing every year. It's called well, actually, it started out once a year. Now it's like 4 times a year, called Serve Your City.
Yeah.
And many different churches of varying denominations and non-denominational churches participate in this.
That sounds like Tim Keller's idea, is it?
It might be.
Yeah,
I don't know where it came from, but it's been around quite a while here, where they get information from the various cities that are in, I mean, there's a lot of suburbs and small cities in this big metropolitan conglomerate where I live. But they get each one of these various cities or local schools or local homeless shelters to detail what their needs are and what they want. You know, do they need something painted? Do they need a garden refurbished? Do they, is there a neighborhood that just needs to be updated? Are there handicapped people who need some help fixing up their house? Whatever it might be, they put together all these opportunities, and then they offer the church people, here's an opportunity to serve, pick one, get involved. And I think it's a great thing, because I think there are a lot of people waiting to serve, but they don't know how to go about it themselves. And if somebody else will do the administration and put it together and say, you know,
in a sense, that was the case with me when I arrived here. I mean, I wouldn't have come up with an initiative like this on my own, you know. But the fact that there was already a kind of a structure in place, you know, which I could begin to contribute to in some way, you know, I think it's, and the fact of that being able to be done during COVID, you know, which has been very challenging for churches and has, I suppose, resulted in withdrawal a lot of people, rather than engagement. Necessarily, because we haven't been able to engage, you know, it hasn't been possible. So so I think I'm quite kind of, well, optimistic is perhaps putting it too strongly, but I can see signs of renewal, and in many of the senses in which we've been talking about, you know, Christians from different traditions coming together, and also, you know, churches being more incarnationally involved in the community. And
well, and there's one kind of maybe I would say piece of advice that I could offer to you for the initiative that you're working on there with these folks that are learning to do restaurant work and so forth, and maybe even their family members. And because probably these people that are working, they also have family members that could get more involved with people in the church. I think one of the things that I guess that's me getting some feedback, I don't know why, but one of the things that I think we neglect is to recognize that they also have something to give, and they also probably want to give something. And so I think this idea of asking the immigrant families to maybe come to your house and teach you how to cook something from their
That sounds like a
their world, and then you all eat together, you know. Then they feel like they've offered something, which they have, because they've offered something that we couldn't get anywhere else. You know, how do you can go to a restaurant and eat food from some other country, but that's only the restaurant food. The home cooked food is entirely different, you know, and how else are you going to get a chance at that home cooked food if you don't do something like that? So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that we need to be willing to serve and to be served with humility, and that there's a way to develop relationship that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you for that. You know, that has given me food for thought.
Cool.
Food for thought, so to speak.
Yeah. So was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we?
Well, I don't know how you know, as I said in one of the messages, you know, lots of different issues have been kind of racing about inside my head, and I find some of your conversations fascinating. You know, with is it Paul Anleiter?
Yes. Paul Anleiter.
Anleiter. Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting conversation, and I'm not sure if it was the conversation in which you were commenting or on the hero's journey. I think that topic came up in, well, one of the conversations. I can't remember. This is something that Paul Vanderklay has been addressing quite a lot as well. And it's something that I'm just kind of beginning to get my head around. It's a characteristic of many of most of the films, including the the Marvel hero films, you know, that people find so engaging. You know, the journey of the hero, the evolution of the hero, the ups and downs, the kind of roller coaster experience, until he reaches a point, he or she, you know, reaches a point at which they're really able to give and transform communities through their. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the hero's journey. It's not only for the benefit of the individual, him or herself, but it's in order to kind of train them to be sources of enlightenment, sources of insight, sources of well-being, of restoration, for a community that was in really dire straits before this individual was called, in a sense, or destined to assume that role. And Paul Vanderklay talked about this in a recent conversation. The kind of U shape, where the hero finds him or herself kind of in this trough, the trough of despair, you know, to use
in there.
Yes.
Not that I'm a hero, but I've been there a number of times. Yeah.
I mean, the Pilgrim's Progress is a great example of this, even though it's not community orientated, but orientated towards the the salvation of the individual rather than the salvation of the community through the individual, you know. So it's, and you know, thinking of some examples from the patriarchs, the Bible gives lots of examples of broken, fractured heroes in that sense, you know, who are called to fulfill a role that initially they are not at all prepared for, but through a process of training and making mistakes, you know, they achieve this transformative kind of power in a sense, you know, which and they, in the case of the Bible, as Paul pointed out, none of the biblical heroes really cut it in the end. They show promise. They serve to produce transformation. In the case of David, in the case of Samson, in the case of Solomon, for example, they bring about the kind of transformation that we are, as I suppose, as people of faith, as believers, we are called to bring about in our communities. But then things go wrong, and they end up making a mess of things and going off the rails, being derailed by sin. But then all of this this whole narrative culminates in the incarnation, in Jesus, the hero that did not fail. And so I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with this, but it's just it's something that I need to think about this a bit more before, if we ever have another conversation. So I'm thinking of examples from literature as well, you know, the hero's journey. This is one of the issues that I can focus on in talking about a play by Shakespeare, a 19th century novel, you know, questions like trace the journey of the protagonist. Is it a journey towards self-transformation, transformation of the community? What is the basis of the transformation? What is it that drives this character? What is it that impels him or her? You know, a great example. Well, and I could give lots of examples, but
let me give you a little suggestion from. So this is when I was a pretty new Christian. We got invited to join a group. I don't remember what the group was called. It was an actual group. And the whole point of this group was to go into churches that were dead or dying, or nominal churches that really didn't have faith anymore, but somehow, by some miracle of grace, had gotten a believing pastor. And so the believing pastor would call people from this group to come in and help him have a weekend. They just called it an assembly. They didn't call it a revival meeting or anything like that. The format of the weekend was we'd have an assembly on Friday night. We'd sing some hymns, maybe do a special song or something like that. And there would be a very brief teaching, but then I think we were all couples. One of the couples would get up and give a testimony of how we came to know Christ. And then the next day we'd go and have breakfast at different people's homes. The couples would break up and each go to a different home. And then that afternoon, we'd go to the nursing homes and visit people. And then on Saturday night, there would be another big assembly with some more testimonies. And then on Sunday morning, there'd be a final service. So at the Friday night service, after the singing and all of that, we'd break up into small groups with the people in the church, and each couple would be with 10, 15 people maybe from the church. And we would say to them, how would you describe your spiritual journey, where you're at right now? So we give them a piece of graph paper. Show me on this graph paper where you're at right now. This would be highly spiritual. This would be kind of, struggling. But go back to the beginning when you were a child and kind of trace your trajectory. What was your trajectory? Mm-hmm. Were there moments where you felt closer to God? Were there moments you felt farther away from God? And then you just draw this on the graph. And then after they would draw it on the graph, we would say, does anybody want to share what their graph means? Or, what the hinge points were in causing these various feelings on your spiritual journey. So interesting how just that one question would open up people who had not been exposed to what we would call biblical faith. They were in a pretty much a dead church where they saw going to church as kind of a social club. But they were willing to open up to a very simple question like that. Just tell us about your spiritual journey. And people would just open up amazingly. And we didn't give them any directions or suggestions of what to do with that or anything. We just listened. Mm-hmm. And then by the time Sunday would roll around, the question that they asked at the end to everybody who was still there, and a lot of people would come, man, people loved this thing. The question we would ask them at the end is, are you, based on what you've heard this weekend, are you willing to give as much of yourself as you understand to as much of God as you can understand at this point, and make a commitment to try to learn more? That was all we would ask, but that would often be enough to open people up so that this believing pastor then kind of had a place to start with his new congregation. And it was a very interesting time in life, but I always felt like that graphing out your spiritual journey was super helpful, because we had to do it too, and then you have to think back, well, was there a time when I was a child where God seemed more real to me? Or, was there a time when something happened in my life that just made me shut the door?
Sounds like the kind of thing that might help to avoid the deconstruction process that is happening, this deconstruction phenomenon, that mm-hmm. I think subject has come up in some of your conversations as well, that
I had a great conversation yesterday with a young church planter in the Anglican church, and he said something I thought was so great. He said, because he's had a lot of friends that have deconstructed. Mm-hmm. He said, the thing is that people aren't drawn to the church because of whatever kind of worship that you've got or whatever kind of exciting mm-hmm. teaching that, people are drawn to the church because they're drawn to you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're drawn to the fellowship of the believers. Now, if you have great worship and you have great teaching, that's what, and your suffering, all those things go into transforming the believers so that the believers become the kind of people that other people want to be with. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's all about becoming. Oh, and this makes me think back. Before I went as a missionary, I had to go through some training with a group called Missionary Internship in Detroit, Michigan. Great organization. And one of the things that they had us do was go out onto this area of Detroit that's kind of called Skid Row. Mm-hmm. But they didn't want us going out there alone. So first they introduced us to a local church, which I don't know if that church is there anymore, but it was called it was a Lutheran church, something Lutheran.
Mhm.
I don't remember, but the pastor was he was probably one of the wisest men I've ever heard. And he had written a lot of books, but he did not publish the books under his own name because he didn't want any credit for anything. So he used to use the nom de plume. Oh, Messiah Lutheran. So
Mhm.
he used the nom de plume M.B. Room as his name because it was the Messiah Book Room. So everything was published under M.B. Room, and his writings were just so powerful, especially about being out in the wilderness and what that means, and being transformed by Christ. And so then he took us out onto Skid Row, and it was like watching. I don't want to be heretical here, because I don't mean it that way at all. But if I could imagine what it was like being with Jesus and watching how the crowds reacted to him, walking out on a Skid Row with that man was like that, because
Mhm.
it was just like they just gathered around him wherever we went. All these homeless people and these alcoholics and addicts, they would just gather around him and listen to every word he said because they loved him so much, you know. It was just a beautiful thing because he had been transformed by Christ. And so he had that fragrance and he had that beauty. And that's what it's all for, is that we be transformed so that we become the kind of people that draw people
Yeah.
to the one for whom we live, not for us.
Yeah. That's I mean, participatory knowledge par excellence, isn't it? You know, that's it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's inviting people just without even being conscious of it, you know, just by the quality of your life, you know, engaging people's attention and commitment. You know, and as a result of inner transformation rather than as a result of personal charisma, you know, because that can go to your head, you know, and people are attractive for that reason, or unattractive for the same reason, because they either have or lack the kind of charisma that is somehow kind of seductive initially in the short term, but it doesn't have the staying power that that it needs to have unless there is inner transformation. And yeah, I mean, that's the challenge that faces all of us, I suppose, you know, to be that kind of follower of Christ, you know, not just tagging along, but actually being an agent of the same kind of grace that he exuded, you know, and that that's very helpful. Yeah.
Yep. Well, you know,
Okay.
I got to get going, but I'm just going to leave you. There's a book that I've never read, but I love the title of it. And I think the author was Eugene Peterson, but the title of the book is A Long Obedience in the Same Direction.
In the same direction. I've heard of the book. I haven't really read it.
I haven't read it either, but even the title is enough to tell me.
The title is very compelling, isn't it?
Yeah,
you know,
that's what I want. A long obedience.
There's something in us that shuns that, or that that finds that a bit too demanding, you know. But the gospel is demanding, after all. In spite of being free, it's also.
Well, and there's also this desire for novelty, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe that little path over there is more interesting than the path I'm on. Yeah. Well, this has been delightful, Roger. Thank you so much. And like I said, I will put the link to your essay. I think I'll link all three of them, because if you go to the first one, it doesn't link the other two. So
that's right. It's only the third one that links the other two.
Has the links, yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for reaching out to me.
Well, thank you. Maybe we can chat again at some point.
That'd be great.
In the future. Yeah.
Okay. Have a good day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care. You too. Bye.